The dress had been altered 3 times. Genevieve Proulx knew this because she had done 2 of the alterations herself, taking in the waist after her mother passed, and then letting it out again during the months that followed, when grief had a way of sitting in the body like ballast. The 3rd alteration had been done by a seamstress in Lethbridge, a week before Genevieve was supposed to become the wife of a man named Conrad Weiss. She had the dress still. It was folded at the bottom of her traveling trunk, wrapped in brown paper, because she had not been able to bring herself to look at it, and she had not been able to bring herself to leave it behind. The stagecoach rattled over a shallow creek crossing, and she pressed one hand flat against the seat to keep herself upright. The other hand held a letter, though she had read it so many times since Lethbridge that the paper had gone soft at the folds. It was from a woman named Mrs. Priscilla Dunmore, who ran a dry goods and post office out of a town called Harrow Creek in the high ranch country south of Calgary. The letter was short. It said there was work for a woman who could keep accounts and write a fair hand. It said the position came with a room above the store. It said to come by the 1st week of October if she was coming at all. Genevieve Proulx was 26 years old. Her parents were gone. Her engagement was not. The engagement had simply ceased to exist on a Tuesday morning in late September, when she had gone to Conrad Weiss's door to return a brooch his mother had lent her, and a young woman she did not recognize had answered wearing Conrad's dressing gown. She had not cried. Not then. She had said, very politely, "I beg your pardon," and she had turned and walked back down the front steps and all the way to the end of the block, where she sat on a low stone wall for a long time watching a sparrow pull something apart in the gutter. The crying had come later, at home, with the door locked and the curtains drawn. She had allowed herself one full afternoon of it. Then she had risen, washed her face, and begun writing letters. Mrs. Dunmore's had been the only one that answered. The town of Harrow Creek was smaller than she had imagined. A main road of packed dirt, lined with a general store, a livery, a barber shop, a church with a listing steeple, and a handful of other buildings that seemed to be leaning into one another for warmth. The stagecoach deposited her and her trunk at the far end of the road and did not linger. She stood for a moment in the thin October light, the wind pulling at the brim of her hat, and took stock of things. Mrs. Priscilla Dunmore turned out to be a small, precise woman in her 60s, with iron-gray hair, and the manner of someone who had decided long ago that sentimentality was a luxury she could not afford. She looked Genevieve over with frank assessment when she came through the door of the dry goods store, took in the good quality of her coat and the shadows under her eyes, and said nothing about either. "You're later than I expected," she said. "The stage was delayed out of Calgary," Genevieve replied. "A wheel." Mrs. Dunmore made a sound that might have been acceptance, and led her to the back room, where the accounts were kept in 2 large ledgers that had clearly not been touched since spring. She tapped them with one finger. "My eyesight," she said simply. "I'll need everything entered and balanced by end of month. The room's upstairs. Supper's at 6. I don't keep a kitchen after that." The room was small and cold, with a brass bedstead and a window that looked out over the backyard to the open prairie beyond. The prairie went on so long and so flatly that it seemed less like land and more like an idea someone had once had about land. Genevieve stood at the window for a long moment after Mrs. Dunmore left. The sky was enormous here. It made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. She unpacked her trunk methodically. She put the brown paper parcel at the very back of the wardrobe and closed the door on it. She went to work on the ledgers the next morning. The work suited her. Numbers, unlike people, did not change their stories halfway through. She worked in the back room while Miss Dunmore tended the shop, and in the afternoons she would sometimes help at the counter while the older woman rested her eyes. She learned the rhythms of the town quickly, the way a small place has rhythms, because there are not many people to vary them. She learned that the blacksmith was a quiet young man named Obadiah Cole, who turned red whenever anyone spoke to him. She learned that the barber, Mr. Stetson, had opinions about everything and would share them at no charge. She learned that Mrs. Dunmore made the best butter tarts in the county and knew it, and that she parceled this knowledge out in small portions to keep people coming back. And she learned, in the way you learn things in a small town without anyone telling you directly, about the man who ran the horse ranch 8 miles east. His name was Callum Reed. He came into Harrow Creek once every few weeks, usually on Fridays, for supplies and to collect his post. He was 38 years old, a widower of 4 years, and he had a reputation for being fair in business and unsociable in everything else. He had taken over the ranch from his father-in-law after his wife died, having nowhere else to be, as one person put it to Genevieve in a low voice, as if this were information of some sensitivity. She first saw him on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her arrival, when he came in earlier than usual for a spool of baling wire. She was behind the counter. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered into something angular and quiet. He wore a canvas work coat and the particular expression of a man who had learned to get through the day with as few words as possible. He looked at her with a brief, assessing glance, the way you would note a new piece of furniture, and then said to the space somewhere past her left shoulder, "Baling wire. 1/2 inch. We have it," she said. "I know you have it," he said, not unkindly. "That's why I came." She found the wire on the back shelf, wrapped it, and told him the price. He paid without comment, took the parcel, and left. Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the doorway to the back room. "That was Mr. Reed," she said, as if this required announcing. "I gathered," Genevieve said. "He's been through a hard time. It seems most people out here have." Mrs. Dunmore considered this and seemed to find it satisfactory. She went back to her rest. He came in again the following Friday for his usual supplies and a letter that had arrived from his brother in Medicine Hat. He paid Mrs. Dunmore and was nearly out the door when he stopped and turned around. Genevieve was adding figures at the counter and did not immediately look up. "The ledgers," he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon. Mrs. Dunmore said you'd sorted her ledgers." "I did." He was quiet for a moment, holding his letter and his parcel, looking at her with an expression she could not read. "Mine are a disaster," he said finally, with the tone of a man making a confession he would rather not make. 3 years of them. I can manage the ranch. I can't manage numbers. That's a common enough division," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to come out and sort them. I pay a fair wage. It would be daytime work, a few weeks at most." He paused. "Mrs. Dunmore could spare you." She thought of the ledgers she had just finished, the satisfaction of bringing order to chaos, the hours of solitude. She thought of her room upstairs with its view of the endless flat sky. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing." A short silence. "Good," he said. "I'll send a wagon on Monday." He left. Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the doorway again with a look that suggested she had heard every word. "He's not much for conversation," Genevieve said, before the older woman could speak. "No," Mrs. Dunmore agreed. "But he's never once said a thing he didn't mean." The wagon came on Monday, driven by a hired hand named Fitch, who was about 17, and spent the entire 8 miles out to the ranch telling her about a colt that had been born the previous spring and was, in his opinion, the finest horse in the southern half of the province. Genevieve listened and watched the land open up around her. The prairie gave way gradually to rolling pasture, and then to a valley she had not expected, sheltered and green even in October, with a creek running along the north edge and the mountains filling the western sky in a great blue wall. The ranch house was solid and plain, built of hewn timber with a long porch facing south. There were a horse barn, a tack shed, 2 corrals, and a bunkhouse, all in a state of hard use but kept in reasonable repair. Callum Reed was at the near corral when they came through the gate, talking to a mare with a wrapped foreleg. He did not immediately turn around. When he did, he gave a short nod and led her inside. The kitchen was clean, in the way that a man's space is clean when he has decided cleanliness is important and has no one to help him maintain it. The ledgers were on the table, 3 thick books, bristling with loose receipts stuffed between the pages, notes written in the margins in handwriting that deteriorated badly under pressure. She opened the first one. "I know," he said, from behind her. "I haven't said anything. You don't have to." She set up her things at the table, and he went back outside. He was in and out throughout the morning, tracking in bits of mud, not making conversation, but not making her feel unwelcome either. There was a certain quality to his presence, a groundedness, a sense of a man who was exactly where he intended to be and not anxious about it, that she found unexpectedly restful. Around midday, he came in, hung his coat on the hook by the door, washed his hands at the basin, and put a kettle on without asking whether she wanted tea. She found she did. He set a cup on the corner of the table, away from her papers, and sat down across from her with his own cup. He looked out the window. "The mare will be right," he said, apparently to the window. She came down on a hard patch, bones not touched. "That's good," Genevieve said. He drank his tea. "You're from the city, Lethbridge. What brought you out here?" She considered what to say. "A job," she said. He looked at her then, and she had the feeling that he knew this was not the whole answer and had decided not to press it. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to looking out the window. He was not slow, she decided. He was deliberate. There was a difference. She fell into a routine. Fitch drove her out Monday morning and back Friday evening, and for 5 days a week, she worked at the long kitchen table, while Callum Reed moved around the edges of her days like weather, present and accounted for but not demanding attention. She learned the shape of his schedule, the early mornings when he was gone before she arrived, the midday return, the long afternoons working close to the barn when the light was good. On the 3rd Monday, there was a plate of biscuits on the table when she arrived, covered with a cloth. They were not elegant biscuits. They were dense and a little lopsided, but they were fresh and they were warm. There was no note. He was already out at the corrals. She ate too and got to work. The following week there was a small jar of honey beside the plate. She did not thank him for these things, because she understood by then that thanks would embarrass him. She simply ate the biscuits and left the cloth neatly folded, and this seemed to be sufficient. She began to know the ranch in the way you know a place when you spend long, quiet hours in it. She knew which board on the porch steps creaked. She knew the particular sound the wind made when it came up fast from the northwest, a low moan through the fence posts that meant you had about an hour to get the washing in. She knew that Callum Reed talked to his horses in a low, continuous murmur, and fell entirely silent around other people, as if language were a resource he rationed carefully. She was watching him from the window one afternoon. When she made this observation, and then caught herself doing it, and looked back at her ledger pages. In the evenings, before Fitch collected her, she would sometimes sit on the porch steps. He would come and sit on the porch railing, at a proper and unambiguous distance, and they would watch the light change on the mountains. Occasionally, he said something. Occasionally, she replied. It was a very comfortable kind of not talking. One evening, he came out of the barn carrying something in one hand. He set it on the step beside her, without a word. It was a small carved figure of a horse, rough-coated and alert, its head lifted as if it had just heard something. The detail was extraordinary for a man's hand so accustomed to rough work. The ears were particular. They were the ears of the mare with the injured leg. "She's fully recovered then," Genevieve said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. 2 weeks passed, he said, and went inside. She carried the horse back to her room above the dry goods store that Friday evening, wrapped in her handkerchief. She set it on the windowsill, where she could see it, while she worked at night. And she did not think too closely about what it meant that she kept touching it. The ledgers were nearly finished by the end of October. She had organized 4 receipts into proper monthly columns, reconciled 3 years of cattle sales and supply costs, identified a significant overpayment to a feed merchant that Callum Reed had simply never noticed, and written him a clear summary of his financial position, which turned out to be considerably better than he had imagined. She presented this to him on a Thursday evening, the last page laid flat on the table. He read it slowly. She watched his face. He was not a man whose expressions announced themselves, but she had been watching him long enough now to read the subtler language, the slight movement at his jaw, the steadiness of his eyes when something surprised him. "I've been overpaying Sorensen for 3 years," he said, "by a significant margin. He knows it, almost certainly." He was quiet. "I'll address that," he said. "The summary is yours to keep. The ledger's in order now." He looked up from the page. "Right," he said. Then, after a pause, "The work's done then." The words dropped into the quiet kitchen. It was the same quiet that had been there for weeks, but it felt different now. She began gathering her pens and her ink bottle. "The pantry wants organizing," he said. She stopped. "And the supply records from the bunkhouse have never been kept separate from the main accounts. They should be." He was looking at his hands now, turned flat on the table. "I know it's more than we agreed to." "I could manage that," she said. He nodded once, not looking at her, and she understood that this was as close as he was going to come for now, to saying something larger. November settled over the valley like a held breath. The work expanded naturally, the way work does when 2 people have stopped pretending. It is the only reason they are in the same place. She organized the pantry. She began keeping the bunkhouse records. She started cooking the midday meal, not because anyone asked her to, but because she was already in the kitchen, and it seemed wasteful not to. He ate without comment, but he always ate everything. He began to split the firewood for the kitchen range before she arrived, so she wouldn't have to ask. She began leaving his tea steep an extra minute, because she had noticed he drank it stronger than most people. Neither of them mentioned these adjustments. They were simply made. She was at the counter of Mrs. Dunmore's store one evening in late November, helping to close up, when Mrs. Dunmore set down the tin of coin she was counting and looked at her. "Letter came today for the Reed Ranch," she said, with studied casualness. "But Fitch had already gone out and come back, so I'll send it Monday." She paused. "From a woman in Pincher Creek, signed herself Miss Callum Reed." Genevieve went very still. "Except of course that's not possible," Mrs. Dunmore said, watching her carefully, "since his wife has been dead 4 years. So someone's writing under a name that isn't hers. Did you read it?" "I'm the postmistress, not a gossip," Mrs. Dunmore said, which was not quite an answer. But the envelope was thin, and the return address was a rooming house. "And I've seen that handwriting on correspondence for this county before. There's a woman in Pincher Creek who sends letters to ranchers, single men mostly, posing as respectable widows looking to settle. Mrs. McPhee." The school teacher there wrote to me about it 2 months ago. She picked up her coin tin again. I thought you should know. Genevieve walked home through the early dark and stood at her window for a long time looking out at the prairie. The carved horse was on the sill. She picked it up. She had not been going to tell him. The decision formed and dissolved several times over the weekend. It was not her business. It was completely her business. He was a practical man who would deal with it practically. He was also a man who did not trust easily, and she knew, without knowing how she knew it, that this would cost him something. She told him on Monday. She found him at the fence line walking the north pasture to check the posts before snowfall. She fell into step beside him without being invited. He glanced at her, then went back to checking the posts. She told him what Mrs. Dunmore had said. She kept her voice level and gave him the facts in the order they mattered. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for several posts. She used Margaret's name, he said finally. Yes. Another long silence. He stopped at a fence post and gripped it, not to test it but to have something to hold. We were married 11 years, he said, not looking at her. She died of pneumonia, February. The ground was frozen and we couldn't bury her until April. He let go of the post. Her name wasn't something I expected to see on an envelope from a stranger. I'm sorry, Genevieve said. I thought about not telling you. Why did you? She considered this honestly. Because you should be able to decide what to do about it yourself. It's not my place to protect you from information. He looked at her then. It was a direct, considering look, the kind that didn't ask to be looked away from. What would you do with it? He asked. In my position. She thought of Conrad Weiss's front door, of the woman in the dressing gown, of herself on the stone wall watching the sparrow. I would do nothing, she said. She doesn't deserve more of your time than it took you to hear about her. Your energy is better spent on the things that are real. Something moved across his face that she didn't quite catch before it settled back into stillness. He turned and began walking again along the fence line. I had a situation something like that, she said, after a moment, because it seemed only fair, before I came here. He waited, she told him. Not everything, but enough. The letters, the engagement, the woman at the door in the dressing gown. She kept her voice even, the way you do when something has stopped being an open wound and become instead a scar you can press without flinching. She told him she had come to Harrow Creek because it was the only answer she had received, and she had needed to go somewhere that wasn't Lethbridge. When she finished, he said, he didn't deserve the year you spent on him. No, she agreed. He didn't. They walked the rest of the fence line without speaking. The mountains caught the low autumn sun and threw it back in shades of copper and slate. A hawk circled far above, riding something she couldn't see. At the gate back to the yard, he stopped. Thank you, he said, for telling me about the letter. Of course. He held the gate. Come and have your tea, he said. The biscuits will be cold, but they were better this morning, I think. I added more butter. She went through the gate. She was balancing the bunkhouse accounts on a Tuesday afternoon in December when she heard Fitch come into the yard earlier than expected. There were voices outside, a woman's and then Callum Reed's, brief and flattened by the cold air, a door shut. Genevieve went on with her, adding, he came inside a few minutes later and sat down across from her. He was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Someone from town? She asked, without looking up. From Pincher Creek, he said. She did look up then. She came on the stage, he said, to introduce herself. She said she'd written. A pause. I told her there'd been a misunderstanding about the name. She took exception to that. He was looking at his hands again. I sent her back to town with Fitch. She can take tomorrow's stage back south. Are you all right? Genevieve asked. I'm fine. He looked up. It was strange to hear that name spoken out loud by someone who had no right to it. He picked up the edge of a receipt she'd set aside and put it back down again. I think I've been. He stopped. Started again. I've been slow to understand something about why this winter is different from the ones before. She waited. He was not a man given to speeches. What he said came out the way the rest of his words did, plain and direct and chosen with some care. You're going to finish the bunkhouse records in another week or two. And then the reason you're here will be done, the same as with the ledgers. He looked at her. Last time I found more work because I wasn't ready to say the thing I should have said instead. You found real work, she said. The pantry was genuinely a problem. The corner of his mouth moved. The pantry was genuinely a problem, he agreed. But that's not the point. He straightened in his chair. The point is that I'd like you to stay. Not as an accounts keeper. He cleared his throat. I would like you to consider whether you might want to marry me. The fire cracked in the range. Outside, the wind had come up from the northwest, and somewhere a gate was knocking against its post. She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking away. You barely know me, she said. I've sat across from you at this table every working day for 2 months, he said. I know you take your tea plain, and you save the difficult columns for the morning when your mind is fresh, and you talk to Fitch's colt through the fence when you think no one is watching. Something in his face settled. I know you told me an uncomfortable truth because you thought I deserved to have it. And I know you chose to leave something painful behind rather than let it define you. He stopped. That's more than I knew about some people I've known for years. She thought about Lethbridge. She thought about the brown paper parcel at the back of the wardrobe. She thought about the carved horse on her windowsill and the biscuits under the cloth and the way the hawk rode the invisible currents above the fence line. She thought about the kitchen window, which faced west, and how every evening the light came through it at a slant that turned the whole room briefly gold. Yes, she said, I'll consider it. He blinked. That's not a yes. It's a yes that wants to be said properly when I've slept on it. She gathered her papers. Ask me again Sunday. He asked her again Sunday. She said yes. Their wedding was in March, when the ground had begun to soften and the creek was running high and cold with snowmelt. The church in Harrow Creek was plain and drafty, and Mrs. Dunmore cried in a manner entirely at odds with her usual economy of feeling. Fitch wore a collar that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable, and stood in the second pew, looking proud of something. Genevieve wore the blue dress she had sewn herself the previous winter, because the brown paper parcel was still in the wardrobe, and she had decided that it could stay there. Some things did not need to be repaired or passed on. They simply needed to be laid down. The dress she wore was better. They drove back out to the ranch in the wagon as the afternoon light was falling long and gold across the fields, and when they came through the gate and she saw the house sitting quiet and solid against the mountains, she felt something settle in her chest with a finality that was like the last piece of a lock clicking over. He helped her down from the wagon. He held her hand a moment longer than was necessary to assist her descent, and then, with his usual practical attention to what needed doing, turned to unhitch the horse. She stood in the yard and looked at the house. The kitchen window faced west. She had known this for months. What she knew now, standing in the late light with the cold air coming off the mountains, was that it was going to be enough, more than enough. 3 years on, the kitchen table that had once held 3 years' worth of chaotic accounts held other things. Flour dust, more often than not, a child's drawing stuck with a pin to the wall nearby, a pair of small boots that had been left on the table, despite several clear instructions to the contrary, belonging to a boy named Henry, who was 2 years old, and had his father's serious eyes and his mother's unwillingness to leave a task unfinished. Callum Reed was on the porch. He was carving something, a small figure, working with the patience and economy of motion that characterized everything he did. Henry was on the step below him, watching the shavings fall, occasionally picking one up to inspect it with great solemnity. Genevieve came out with 2 cups of tea and sat beside her husband. He took his cup without looking up from the carving, and his elbow shifted to make room for her in the way that happens when 2 people have occupied a space together long enough that they do it without thinking. "What is it?" she asked, nodding at the carving. "Rabbit," he said. He asked for a rabbit. Henry, below them, looked up at the word and said, "Rabbit," in a tone of grave approval, and went back to his shaving. Genevieve wrapped both hands around her cup. The light was doing the thing it did in late afternoon, falling across the yard and turning the fence posts copper and the mountains deep blue. The hawk was up again, or one very like it, a dark shape riding the cold updraft above the eastern ridge. She thought sometimes, still, about the woman who had stood on a platform in Lethbridge with a train ticket and too much hope and no very clear idea of what she was heading toward. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt something warmer and more complicated, a kind of tenderness for someone who had been wrong about the destination and right, without knowing it, about the direction. The thing she had been looking for had not been in Lethbridge. It had not even been in the letter she had answered, the advertisement posted in the paper, the name of any place or person she had set out toward. It had been in an unexpected valley south of Calgary, at a table covered in 3 years of disorder, beside a man who did not have the words for what he meant, but had never once said anything he didn't. Callum handed her the half-finished rabbit without interrupting his own thinking, just passed it to her so she could see the shape of it. She turned it in her hands. The ears were taking form. They were very good ears. She handed it back. The mountains caught the last of the light and held it. A moment, the way mountains do, as if considering whether to give it back, and then let the dark come on slowly, and the first stars opened above the ridge, and the house behind them was lit and warm. It was not the life she had planned. It was better than the life she had planned. It was, she had come to understand, the kind of life that cannot be planned, only arrived at, by being willing to keep going after the thing you thought you were heading for has failed to appear. She leaned her shoulder against his. He didn't look up from the carving, but he leaned back.